The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Laura Bennett pushed through the double doors of the trauma unit at Seattle General, her badge clipped to scrubs that had been washed so many times the fabric felt thin as paper. 3:06 a.m. The shift stretched ahead like a long corridor she'd walked 1,000 times before, each step measured, each breath controlled, her hands already moving through the mental checklist of vital signs and medication counts before her feet found the first station. Nobody watched her arrive. She wouldn't have wanted them to. She moved through the ICU with the kind of precision that made the younger nurses pause mid-conversation, though they couldn't have explained why. Not because she was fast, she wasn't. Not because she was loud, she'd learned a decade ago that silence carried more weight than volume. It was something in the way her fingers found a pulse, steady and certain, the way her eyes assessed a patient's breathing without the hesitation that marked most staff members. Her shoulders carried scars that belonged to a different life, hidden beneath the scrub she wore like a second skin, and in her locker on the third shelf sat a photograph and a folded flag with military precision creases sharp enough to draw blood. Room for 12 was her second stop of the morning. The young man there, 26 years old, recovering from a fourth reconstructive surgery on his left shoulder, lay with his eyes half closed, the kind of injured calm that came from pain medication and morphine dreams. His forearm bore her name in military stencil font, Laura, tattooed in capital letters, a debt he'd thought was worth that permanent ink. The irony was that he wouldn't recognize her if she walked into a bar tomorrow wearing civilian clothes. The head injury had taken pieces of memory, left gaps where faces should have been clear, and when she leaned close to adjust the foreline running into his wrist, his eyes tracked something distant, unfocused, unable to land on her. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft enough not to startle him, but steady, the kind of steady that came from having said the same words to soldiers who were bleeding out, to medics working by flashlight in the dark, to people whose survival depended on someone else's composure. She didn't introduce herself. After 3 years at Seattle General, most patients knew her by sight, though the ones like him, with the fractured memories and the pharmaceutical hazes, never quite pieced it together. She checked the monitor, heart rate stable at 72, oxygen saturation at 98%, blood pressure holding at 114/70. The numbers were good. The numbers were always good when she was the one looking at them. Her fingers moved across his shoulder, dressing with practiced efficiency, checking for signs of infection, for pulling at the sutures, for anything that would suggest the tissue beneath was angry and inflaming. The bandage was clean. The wound was healing. She noted it all in the chart with the kind of precise documentation that caught the attention of auditors and liability managers, though it caught the attention of one person in particular for very different reasons. Dr. James Pierce stood in the doorway of room for 12 with his arms crossed, watching her work. He'd been there for at least 40 seconds, Laura's peripheral vision sharp enough to register his presence without turning her head. Combat awareness was a difficult skill to completely set down, even when you weren't in combat anymore. He was chief of surgery, 48 years old, a man whose family name had appeared on the donor wall of 3 hospitals in North Carolina, whose credentials hung framed in his office, and whose confidence was the kind that came from 20 years of never being questioned by anyone below him on the medical hierarchy. The thing about Dr. Pierce was that he saw nurses the way a concert pianist sees the roadies who transport the instruments. Useful. Essential, perhaps, in the way that engines are essential. But not the performance itself. Not the art. And Laura Bennett, who moved through his trauma unit with a competence that occasionally made him tense his jaw, was becoming a roadie who stood out too much, who seemed to understand too much, whose hands moved with a certainty that suggested she'd done some version of this work in a context he couldn't quite place. "Good shift so far?" he asked, the question directed at her but framed in a way that suggested he didn't particularly care about the answer. He was younger than him by 12 years, which meant he'd been practicing medicine before she'd even put on scrubs, a fact he seemed to find comforting. "Quiet," Laura said, checking the monitor one final time before turning to face him, her expression neutral, deferential even, the kind of careful politeness that belonged to someone who knew how to move through hierarchies, who understood that certain people in certain rooms needed to be made to feel important. "No admits for 3 hours. That won't last," Pierce said, moving further into the room now, his presence seeming to expand as he crossed the threshold. He was wearing the kind of suit under his white coat that suggested he had another engagement later, somewhere more important than the trauma unit where he'd trained for 2 decades. His tie was silk. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. We're heading toward the first major weather system of the season. Car accidents increase 47% in the first heavy rain after a dry spell. People forget how to drive. He was right. Laura had already noted the forecast on her phone before arriving: thunder moving in around 7 a.m., sustained rainfall, wind gusts up to 35 miles per hour. The highways would fill with people who'd been driving the same routes in dry conditions for months, suddenly overconfident, suddenly miscalibrating. She'd seen it before. She'd lived it before, though in different contexts, under different skies, with different stakes. "I'll be ready," she said, and turned back to the 4 line, adjusting the flow rate with a kind of minute precision that suggested she'd done the calculation in her head without having to think about it. 12 milliliters per hour. The medication was running clear through the tubing. She made a note in the chart. What happened next happened in the way most things happen in hospitals, without drama, without any indication that the moment mattered, that it would eventually become important. An intern, fresh out of medical school, approached the medication cart outside room for 12 with a chart in one hand and a printed order in the other. His name was Chen. He'd been at Seattle General for 4 weeks. He was still learning to read the digital ordering system, still making the kinds of mistakes that everyone makes when they are new. The order was for 20 milliliters of morphine solution, a standard post-operative analgesic for patients recovering from major surgery. But the dose was wrong. Chen's eyes had misread the decimal point, or the screen had displayed it in an unusual font, or some other small human error had occurred, and he was reaching for a concentration of 50 milligrams per milliliter instead of the 10 milligrams per milliliter that the patient would need. 20 milliliters of the wrong concentration would have been a lethal dose. It wouldn't have been a dramatic thing, no sudden collapse, no monitors screaming. The young man in room for 12 would have fallen asleep more deeply than usual and simply never woken up. Laura saw it. Not because she was standing at the medication cart, she wasn't. Not because she had a special vision that caught errors from across the unit. She was walking past with a chart and a fresh bag of normal saline, and her eyes caught the label on the bottle Chen was reaching for, and something in her brain that had been trained to recognize mistakes under fire, in the dark, with blood on her hands and time running out, simply noted the discrepancy. She stopped. Set the saline down. Moved toward the cart with the kind of casual smoothness that suggested she was simply doing a routine task, restocking, organizing, the normal work of nursing that belonged to the background of any hospital ward. "Wrong concentration," she said quietly to Chen, pulling the bottle gently from his hand. "This is 50. We need the 10. Chen blinked. He'd been staring at the order for 5 seconds straight, his mind locked on the numbers, and hadn't seen the error. "Oh. Right. Thank you." "Happens," Laura said, finding the correct bottle from the secondary refrigerator, setting it beside his chart. Decimal points are small. It was the kind of correction that happened dozens of times per shift in any hospital. Nurses caught physicians' errors, physicians caught nurses' errors, pharmacists caught everyone's errors. The system was built on the assumption that humans made mistakes, and therefore redundancies existed. It was exactly the kind of moment that shouldn't have mattered to anyone. But Dr. Pierce had walked out of room for 12 in time to see it. He'd watched Laura intercept the medication, seen her redirect Chen toward the correct concentration, witnessed the moment when a junior physician took guidance from a registered nurse without question or hesitation. And his jaw had done that thing it did when he was irritated, the small, almost imperceptible tightening that happened just at the hinge, a barely visible signal of something internal shifting. He'd paused at the nursing station, speaking in a low voice to one of the residents, his eyes still tracking Laura as she organized the medication cart back to his satisfaction. "You have to watch the nurses on this unit," he'd said, his tone conversational, almost friendly, the kind of observation that sounded like mentorship to anyone listening. "They start thinking they understand medicine after a few years. They see enough patients, enough orders, and suddenly they believe they're physicians. It's a respect thing. You have to maintain the hierarchy or they'll exceed their scope. You'll have M trying to diagnose patients, trying to prescribe medication. It becomes a real problem. The resident, a second-year surgery resident named Patterson, had nodded the way residents always nodded when the chief of surgery spoke, which is to say, without processing most of what was being said, simply acknowledging that information had been transmitted. But the words had been spoken. The seed had been planted. The moment of Laura's competence, which should have been unremarkable, had been reframed as a violation, as an overreach, as a threat to the order of things. The rain came at 6:51 a.m., exactly as forecast. The first accident report came through at 6:52, a three-car collision on the interstate, northbound, mile marker 47. 2 patients en route, both critical. By 7:15, there were 6 more incidents cascading through the system. The shift that had been quiet at 3 in the morning had transformed into the kind of controlled chaos that made Seattle General's trauma unit hum with purpose. Laura moved through it all without hesitation, without looking for direction, anticipating what each patient would need before they arrived, positioning equipment, checking supplies, the kind of invisible work that made other people's work possible. She understood flow in the way that people understand breathing after they've learned to do it in environments where every breath might be their last. But she moved with enough deference, enough careful politeness, that nobody watching would have thought she was anything other than a very competent nurse doing her job. That was the mistake everyone made about her. They assumed the competence came from experience. They didn't see the muscle memory. They didn't see the way her fingers paused on certain pressure points when starting and reading for the artery the way some people read faces, learned knowledge, battlefield knowledge, the kind of skill that came from working in field hospitals with combat medics, from hands-on triage when seconds mattered and mistakes cost lives. When she'd inserted the 4 line on one of the new trauma admissions, a woman with a fractured femur and 2 broken ribs, brought in from the 3-car collision, her hands had moved with the precision of someone who'd placed lines in difficult vessels under fire, and the needle had found the vein on the first attempt, smooth and certain. Dr. Pierce had been supervising the resuscitation bay. He'd watched her work. And for the first time, his jaw hadn't tightened. Instead, he'd looked away, his attention refocusing on the trauma surgeon's role, on the hierarchy that he controlled, on the space where his authority was absolute and unchallenged. By 9:15 a.m., the crisis had stabilized. The 6 patients were distributed through the ICU and surgical units. The monitoring continued. The shift shifted into recovery mode, documentation, cleaning, reorganization. Laura stayed through the end of her shift, completing her charting, checking her patients, following up on the 4 lines and medication orders and vital sign trends that had absorbed her attention for the past 6 hours. She was pulling off her gloves near the medication cart, the latex snapping like a gunshot in the sudden quiet of the unit, when she noticed Dr. Pierce standing behind her, his white coat exchanged now for the silk suit beneath, his presence conveying something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was something in between, the look of someone who'd been reminded of something he'd been working to forget. He didn't say anything. He just watched her finish organizing the cart, watched her turn to leave, watched her move toward the locker room where the folded flag waited on the 3rd shelf, where the photograph of her teammate waited, where the other life she'd left behind waited in the dark, quiet space that belonged only to her. The day shift was beginning. The fluorescent lights would hum on for another 12 hours. The patients in room for 12 and all the others would continue their recoveries, their healing, their slow return to the lives they'd been living before trauma brought them to Seattle General. But something had shifted. Dr. Pierce had seen something he didn't understand and didn't like, and that made him dangerous in a way that quiet people recognized immediately. It wasn't the danger of someone who'd underestimated you. It was the danger of someone who'd seen you clearly, who'd recognized something in your competence that didn't match the position you claimed to hold, and who'd decided that the hierarchy needed to be protected from that discrepancy. Laura knew what was coming. Not the specifics, those would reveal themselves in time. But the shape of it, the pattern, the way powerful men responded when they felt their power questioned by someone they decided shouldn't matter. She'd seen it before. She'd survived it before. But the knowledge of it, the certainty that it was coming, sat in her chest like a weight as she drove home through the rain, her hand steady on the wheel, her eyes on the wet road ahead, knowing that the next phase was beginning. The medication room smelled of antiseptic and plastic, shelf after shelf of labeled vials arranged with military precision. Laura was verifying the 1,400-hour Coumadin doses when Dr. Pierce blocked the doorway, his presence suddenly filling the small space like a tank engine idling in a confined garage. Nurses who play doctor end up unemployed. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. "Remember your place, Miss Bennett." She didn't look up from the medication cart. Her hands remained steady, her jaw clenched just enough that someone watching would have noticed the muscle there, but not so much that it showed weakness. "Understood, Dr. Pierce." He waited for more. When nothing came, he turned and left, his footsteps sharp against the tile floor. 3 hours later, during morning rounds, the Anderson family surrounded their mother's bed, daughter in a cardigan, son-in-law holding a coffee cup, the patient looking small between the white sheets. Dr. Pierce moved through the room with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. He was ordering a medication adjustment when Laura stepped forward. "Doctor, Mrs. Anderson's on metoprolol for her arrhythmia. That dosage of nifedipine will create a compound interaction. Her heart rate could drop critically." The room went quiet. The daughter's eyes widened. The son-in-law set his coffee down slowly. Dr. Pierce turned to face her, and his smile was the kind a predator shows before it strikes. "Our nurse here seems to think her 3-year degree trumps my 20 years of surgical experience." He addressed the family, not Laura. "Tell me, how does a nursing credential qualify someone to countermand physician orders?" Laura took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their endless fluorescent hum. She met his eyes and spoke in a voice that came from somewhere deeper than her chest, somewhere that had called coordinates into radios while dust storms turned the sky rust-colored. "The same experience that taught me patient safety outranks ego." Mrs. Anderson's daughter made a small sound. Dr. Pierce's face flushed the color of raw meat, but he didn't respond. He simply turned his back and continued rounds, dismissing Laura with a gesture that looked like swatting away an insect. Within an hour, the nursing director requested a meeting. Within 2 hours, Pierce was having a calculated conversation with her, his voice measured and reasonable in the hallway outside the nurse's station. "I'm concerned about scope of practice violations. She's questioning my medical judgment in front of patients. It's undermining the whole care team. I'm not trying to be difficult, but we have to maintain standards." The nursing director nodded, her face troubled. She was a good woman who'd been in healthcare for 28 years. She also had 3 supervisors above her who had 0 patience for conflict. By the time the afternoon staff meeting began, the wheels were already in motion. Pierce stood at the front of the conference room with a clipboard. 12 nurses sat in plastic chairs arranged in rows. Laura sat in the back, her hands folded in her lap. "We've had some concerns about scope of practice recently," Pierce began, his eyes finding Laura's across the room. "Competence means knowing your limitations. It means understanding the hierarchy that exists for patient safety reasons. A nurse's job is to execute physician orders, not to question them. Especially not in front of families." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "When nurses think they're doctors, people get hurt." 3 nurses shifted uncomfortably. One cleared her throat. Another suddenly became very interested in her phone. Laura didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. The tremor in her hands wasn't fear, it was restraint, the same restraint that had kept her silent through months of interrogation training where they taught you that composure under pressure was armor. The break room was nearly full when she entered at 1,630 hours. The fluorescent lights made everything look like a medical examiner's office, harsh, clinical, exposing. There on the unit board, printed and laminated and highlighted in yellow, was her name. Formal written notice, insubordination and unauthorized medical advice. Laura Bennett. Code citations. Date. Dr. Pierce's signature in a handwriting that was surprisingly neat for a man's. The room cleared like someone had pulled a fire alarm. A trauma nurse abandoned her half-finished turkey sandwich. The charge nurse suddenly remembered a patient call that couldn't wait. A resident grabbed her bag and left without explanation. Within 40 seconds, only Laura remained in the break room with its humming vending machine and its terrible fluorescent lights and its smell of microwaved coffee from that morning. She poured her coffee into a chipped mug, the same mug she'd bought at a gift shop in Kandahar in 2021, the same mug that had survived 3 moves and 2 dishwashers. The coffee was lukewarm. She drank it anyway, letting the bitterness sit on her tongue. One tear slid down her cheek and she wiped it away without breaking stride, without closing her eyes, without any of the performances that broken people used. Dr. Pierce was walking past the break room door. She let him get exactly 3 steps beyond before she spoke. Interesting how fragile confidence becomes when it's questioned by someone you've decided shouldn't matter. He stopped. His shoulders stiffened. For a moment he seemed to consider turning around, but he didn't. He just kept walking, his footsteps growing quieter until she heard the elevator doors open and close somewhere down the hallway. But that wasn't the worst part. By afternoon, Pierce had reassigned her to the night shift ICU, isolation disguised as rotation. She'd be working under a charge nurse who was loyal to him, with a team that wouldn't risk their own positions by being seen with her. The whispers followed her through every hallway like exhaust fumes, overreaching, arrogant, thinks she knows more than physicians, someone should tell her about the write-up before she embarrasses herself further. By 2200 hours, Laura was pulling on fresh scrubs for the night shift. The ICU at Seattle General transformed after dark, the hallways became longer, the lights seemed dimmer despite their intensity, the machines beeping took on a different rhythm, more isolated, more like a ticking clock. She moved through the unit making her initial rounds, checking monitors, verifying drips, her hands moving through the practice motions of a nurse who'd done this thousands of times. Outside room for 12, she paused. The veteran from Bagram was sleeping, his breathing easy, his recovery progressing exactly as it should. His left arm lay across the blanket and the tattoo was visible, 3 letters arranged in a triangle on his forearm. VPR. Viper. Her call sign. He was barely 20 when she'd carried him through fire 3 years ago, his blood soaking through her uniform while Taliban rounds snapped past like angry hornets. She'd thought he wouldn't remember. She'd thought enough time and enough distance and enough therapy would make her safe in this hospital. She was supposed to be monitoring room 318, the retired contractor suspected of selling classified satellite imagery to Chinese intelligence operatives, the reason she was actually here instead of actually nursing, the reason her credentials came with military intelligence oversight. She touched the folded flag in her pocket, the flag from her teammate, the one she'd carried through enemy fire, the one that had traveled with her through 3 years of civilian cover. The fabric was soft with age, worn at the creases, pressed into the shape of whatever it had been folded against for so long. She'd told herself 1,000 times she should retire it, put it somewhere safe, stop carrying a classified memorial through a public hospital. She didn't. The 2,247 hours rounds happened without incident. Labs were normal. Vitals were stable. The contractor in 318 was sleeping. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would catch attention. Nothing that would raise flags with Pierce, who she knew was documenting her movements, who she'd caught reviewing the surveillance footage outside the trauma bay earlier that week, whose vendetta was accidentally threatening national security by disrupting the intelligence operation she'd risked her real identity to protect. Then the alarms came, high-pitched, urgent, screaming from room 307 like an animal in distress. The post-operative trauma case in the corner bed. The one that had come in stable. The one that was supposed to be recovering without complication. Laura grabbed the emergency cart without thinking, muscle memory taking over, her hands already reaching for the defibrillator pads before her conscious mind caught up to what was happening. That was when she heard Pierce's voice calling for a thoracotomy kit, heard him shouting orders to get the OR prepped, heard him say the words that would change everything, "I need that patient upstairs in 8 minutes." And Laura realized, with absolute clarity, that her cover was about to be destroyed, not by her carelessness, but by his incompetence about to cost a patient his life. The ICU corridor at 2:19 a.m. existed in a liminal space between medicine and ghost story. Fluorescent panels cast everything in a blue whitewash that made skin look translucent, corpse-like. Laura's shoes clicked softly against polished tile, the only sound in the hallway besides the synchronized beeping of 8 cardiac monitors behind closed doors, each one keeping time like a metronome in a funeral march. She moved through her rounds with the efficiency of someone who had learned, long ago, that wasted motion was wasted oxygen. Vitals checked. For lines assessed. Medication drips verified against her notes. Room for 10. Room for 11. Then room for 12, where she slowed without meaning to. Through the small window in the door, she could see him. The veteran. 26 years old with a reconstruction bandage across his ribs and his left shoulder wrapped in surgical gauze from a rotator cuff repair that should never have required ICU admission in the first place. But complications came, they always did, and now he lay sedated, peaceful in the way only heavily medicated patients could be. Laura's eyes found the tattoo on his left bicep. Her call sign. In dark blue ink, permanent as a scar. Viper. Across his arm as if she were still there, still the woman who had dragged him through enemy fire in Sanjin Valley, still the captain who had held pressure on a wound while helicopter rotors shook the ground. The tattoo was 3 years old. He'd gotten it in a shop in Kandahar while she was already gone, already dead in every way that mattered, already becoming someone else. She didn't linger. Lingering meant questions. Lingering meant patterns that Pierce could exploit if he was watching, and he was always watching, the way certain men watch things they don't understand and therefore fear. Room 307 was at the far end of the ICU corridor. A 48-year-old man, post-op day 2 from a thoracic resection, his left lung partially removed because of stage 3 adenocarcinoma. He should have been stable. The surgery had gone well. No complications noted in the operative report. No bleeding concerns. Just routine post-operative monitoring, pain management, early mobility. Laura was 3 feet from his room when the first alarm sounded. Not a warning beep. An urgent, escalating wail, the kind of sound that made every muscle in her body recognize danger before her mind caught up. The oxygen saturation monitor. Red numerals flashing like a heartbeat in distress, 89. 84, 78. The numbers were dropping like a stone down a well. She was moving before conscious thought took over. The door opened. The room hit her like a physical force, the smell of antiseptic and human sweat, the sound of the ventilator gasping like a lung trying to breathe underwater, the sight of a man whose lips were turning from pink to a grayish blue. His eyes snapped open, wide with the animal panic of suffocation. His chest heaved. His oxygen sat plummeted, 71. 65, the monitor's alarm climbed in pitch, a sound like a siren caught in a throat. I'm here. Breathe. Laura's voice was steady. It was always steady. It had to be. Oxygen is climbing. You're fine. But he wasn't fine. Nobody was fine anymore. Dr. Pierce burst through the door 14 seconds later, his face flushed, his surgical cap already off and his dark hair disheveled. Behind him came 2 other nurses, Yolanda and Marcus, their eyes wide, their feet hesitant. They knew something was wrong. They could smell it. Fear had an odor in hospitals, metallic and sharp, like copper and electricity. Tension pneumothorax, Dr. Pierce said the words like he was diagnosing someone else's incompetence. Air in the pleural space. The sutures from surgery must have failed. He moved to the bedside with the confidence of a man who had performed emergency thoracotomies before, who had cut through ribs and held beating hearts in his hands. He pulled open the thoracotomy kit with movements that were suddenly, visibly less certain. His hands trembled. Not much. Just enough that Laura saw it. The patient's heart rate dropped. 110, 95. 87. His oxygen saturation continued its descent, 63. 58, the blue tint spreading across his face like a stain. Dr. Pierce reached for the scalpel. His fingers closed around it. Laura watched as he positioned his hand on the patient's left chest wall, attempting to locate the intercostal space between the ribs where the needle should go, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark that lived in muscle memory for anyone who had ever done this correctly. But Pierce's hand wavered. His landmark seemed uncertain. The blade touched skin, then withdrew. Touched again. The sedation's wearing off. Marcus's voice came from somewhere far away. He's moving. Do we need to? I've got it, Dr. Pierce snapped. But his hands told a different story. They told the story of a man who had learned this procedure once, perhaps years ago, perhaps in a textbook, perhaps in a simulation. They told the story of someone about to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The patient gasped. His whole body arched off the bed like electricity was running through him. 54, 49. His heart rate dropped again, 42. 41, the monitor's beeping slowed, the sound of a heart giving up. Laura's mind fractured into two pieces. One piece was the nurse she had learned to be observant, efficient, capable but deferential, aware of hierarchy and scope of practice and the careful politics of deference that kept her invisible. That piece knew that interceding would be overstepping. That piece understood boundaries. That piece could follow orders while a patient died in front of her. The other piece was Captain Laura Bennett, 75th Ranger Regiment attached to JSOC Task Force 121, 12 years of service, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Purple Hearts, 3 surgeries she'd performed in field conditions with equipment that consisted of a combat knife, the contents of a medical aid bag, and the knowledge that the difference between a corpse and a survivor was sometimes just knowing where to cut and how deep. The other piece was Bagram, 2011, a FI base 2 clicks north of the airfield where the nearest surgeon was 40 minutes away and 12 soldiers needed her more than they needed procedure protocols. That piece was the sound of rotor blades and small arms fire and a patient's artery spurting blood like a fountain as she tied it off with sutures meant for skin. That piece was the weight of a body, Corporal James Haig, the man sleeping in room for 12, going limp in her arms after she'd packed the wound and gotten him to the extraction point. The piece that was Captain Bennett could perform a needle decompression with her eyes closed. But Captain Bennett was supposed to be dead. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 44. The monitor's beeping became sporadic, desperate, a heartbeat that was giving up. His lips were almost black now. His eyes had gone glassy, fixed on nothing, the look of someone whose brain was shutting down from lack of oxygen, whose consciousness was already leaving, whose time measured in seconds was almost done. Dr. Pierce's hand trembled around the scalpel. The needle's in. I just need to thread the... No, wait, the anatomy's different, I need to. He didn't finish the sentence. He was lost. The procedure had become abstract to him, a series of steps he'd memorized and now couldn't recall in the proper order, a dance he'd learned once and never practiced, and the music was stopping and the patient was dying and everyone in the room could feel it like a change in air pressure. Laura moved. Her hand closed around the scalpel in Dr. Pierce's grip, firm but not violent, and removed it from his fingers the way you'd take a toy from a child. She didn't ask permission. She didn't say, "Excuse me, Doctor," or "if I may," or any of the careful phrases that had defined her entire tenure at Seattle General. She simply took it because the alternative was a dead patient and because muscle memory was louder than caution and because some things transcended hierarchy. The blade was cold. It had a weight to it, different from a field knife, more refined, less useful in the ways that mattered. But a scalpel was a blade and blade work was blade work and her hands knew exactly what to do with it. The patient's oxygen saturation was 38 now. His heart rate 34. The monitor had almost given up the ghost entirely. Laura positioned her fingers on his left rib cage, feeling for the landmarks, the second intercostal space, the bony ridge of the rib, the soft tissue between that marked the target. Her tactile memory was exquisite. 10 years of hands-on combat medicine had carved the human anatomy into her nervous system the way a map is carved into stone. She felt the space. She knew the depth. She knew exactly how much pressure and exactly which angle. The scalpel moved. Once. Decisive. No hesitation. Blood welled up, not too much, not the spurting hemorrhage that would indicate she'd hit something vital, just the small seeping of tissue announcing that the barrier had been breached. A rush of air followed, a hiss like a tire deflating, the sound of pressure equalizing, the sound of death stepping back. But that wasn't the worst part. The chest tube insertion required precision beyond what most nurses possessed. Laura's hands moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory overriding 3 years of deliberate invisibility. She didn't ask for the scalpel. She took it from Pierce's trembling fingers with the authority of someone accustomed to command. The blade felt familiar in her palm, the weight, the balance, the way it responded to the smallest adjustment of her grip. Between the 4th and 5th ribs. One smooth motion. The incision opened like a mouth exhaling its last breath, and a rush of air followed, that hiss, that terrible escaping whistle of pressure equalizing, the sound of death stepping back. Subcutaneous emphysema bubbled beneath her fingers as she worked. The patient's oxygen saturation had plummeted to 58. Another 30 seconds and cardiac arrest would have been permanent. "Clamp," Laura said. Not a question. An order. The cadence of her voice had shifted, dropped an octave, borrowed the timbre of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A nurse, Rodriguez, according to her badge, handed over the instrument without hesitation, as if her hands had recognized command authority that her mind couldn't yet process. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid into position between the ribs with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed this procedure while rounds of incoming fire snapped overhead at Bagram. Laura secured the tube with swift, economical movements. "High-flow oxygen. Get me a bag of O-negative. Push 0.2 milligrams epi now." Her voice carried the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst things a human body could experience. The room responded to her like a well-trained unit. Monitors beeped their electronic approval. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed, 62, 70, 84, 91. The color returned to his lips. His chest rose and fell in synchronized rhythm with the ventilator. 90 seconds. That was all it had taken. The time it took to break a career. The time it took to save a life. Laura stepped back from the bed, and in that moment of stillness, the full weight of what she'd done settled across her shoulders like a sandbag. She'd blown her cover. She'd revealed training that no civilian nurse possessed. She'd demonstrated expertise that demanded explanation. 3 years of deliberate incompetence, of quiet efficiency masquerading as competence within limits, evaporated in 90 seconds of muscle memory and necessity. Pierce stood at the monitor station, his face the color of old ivory. His eyes tracked her movements with the intensity of a predator watching its own hunter. Not anger. Not yet. Something worse, the narrowed gaze of a man witnessing his own humiliation crystallize into undeniable fact. She'd done what he couldn't do. She'd saved the life he'd let slip toward death. In front of the entire ICU team. In front of witnesses who would never unsee what they'd just witnessed. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, and that silence was a promise. By 6:27 a.m., before the day shift arrived, Dr. Pierce had launched a formal investigation into Laura's credentials. Not a routine check. A formal investigation. He'd called the State Board of Nursing himself at 5:27 in the morning, before the administrative office opened, and left a voicemail questioning the validity of her license. He'd made notes, detailed, meticulous notes, about an unauthorized practice of medicine, about procedures performed outside scope of nursing practice, about a potential credential fraud. He'd reassigned all-night shift witnesses to different floors, different shifts, staggered schedules that prevented them from coordinating their accounts of what had happened in the ICU. Rodriguez was moved to the pediatric unit. The respiratory therapist, Thomas Kim, was transferred to the surgical floor. The nursing assistant who'd handed supplies found herself reassigned to sterile processing, working inventory in the basement with the broken equipment and expired supplies. By 8:15 a.m., Laura's suspension notice was in her personnel file. Not pending resolution. Immediate suspension, pending investigation. The notice was printed on hospital letterhead, signed by hospital administration with Pierce's recommendation highlighted in yellow. Laura read it standing in the staff break room, the fluorescent lights casting everything in shades of institutional white, while 3 nurses who'd been eating breakfast suddenly found reasons to leave. Their half-finished yogurt cups were abandoned. Their coffee grew cold. The room entered like she'd triggered an invisible alarm. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She folded the notice carefully and placed it in her scrub pocket, her jaw tight enough to crack teeth, her breathing controlled with the discipline of someone who'd learned that panic was a luxury that got people killed. She clocked out. She walked to her locker, the one in the back corner, away from the main corridor, and began to pack. The cracked coffee mug from the hospital cafe, the one she'd carried for 3 years without anyone noticing it, had a founder's quote from some military academy. The dying succulent on the shelf, its leaves brown and curled, which she'd kept because something about its stubborn refusal to fully surrender resonated with her. The photograph of Marcus, the teammate she'd carried for 3 miles through sniper fire before his wounds proved beyond field intervention. His funeral flag, carefully folded into a triangle, pressed against the bottom of the box for support. 8 years she'd carried that flag in her locker. 8 years no one had asked what it meant. Rain hammered the parking lot as she walked, the cardboard box growing soft and soggy, threatening to collapse. Her hands were wet. Whether from the rain or from something else, she wasn't certain. The walk from Seattle General's employee entrance to the bus stop took 11 minutes. She counted every one of them. Counted her steps. Counted her breaths. Counted the number of times she'd almost walked back through those doors to find Pierce and explain exactly what it felt like to be expendable. Her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. A text from a blocked number, cover blown. Mission terminated. Extraction 48 hours. Safe house coordinate sent to secure line. Do not return to apartment. 3 months of surveillance work. 3 months of careful documentation, building a case against the patient in room for 12, the one with the classified information and the suspicious visitors at odd hours. 3 months tracking hospital security breaches and document thefts, playing nurse while military intelligence ran their operation through the veneer of routine healthcare. All of it, gone. Burned. Because she'd made a choice between her mission and saving a life, and in that 90-second window, she'd stopped being the operative in the field and started being Captain Laura Bennett again. The rain mixed with something on her face that her hand instinctively wiped away. Her mascara, probably. Rain, definitely. The box grew heavier with each step toward the bus stop, not from physical weight but from the accumulated gravity of consequences. Pierce had dismantled her. He'd done it efficiently, systematically, like a man who'd planned this contingency since the moment she'd corrected his medication order in front of a patient's family. But standing at the bus stop in the rain, shivering in a thin scrub jacket, Laura realized something that made her turn around. Made her walk back toward Seattle General. She had one goodbye left. One person in that hospital who needed to know the truth before she disappeared, before extraction, before she became someone else with someone else's identity in someone else's city. The veteran in room for 12 had called out her name. His voice. She remembered it now. Not from 3 years of nursing shifts. From Bagram. From the firefight. From the moment she'd grabbed his collar and dragged him out of the line of fire while rounds snapped overhead. She had to see him. Just once. To say goodbye. To make sure he knew that what he'd lived for, what she'd carried him for, what she'd bled for, that it mattered. That he was worth the 3 years of invisibility. That even if Pierce destroyed her career, even if military intelligence extracted her, even if she vanished from Seattle General's payroll and personnel records, at least one person would know the truth. The rain didn't stop her. Nothing could have stopped her. She walked back through the employee entrance using her keycard, not yet deactivated, and slipped past the security desk with the invisibility that 3 years of careful navigation had taught her. Up the stairwell. Down the ICU corridor. Toward room for 12. The cardboard box weighed almost nothing, which made sense. 3 years of being invisible doesn't accumulate much. Laura's hands, steady enough to have held lives together in Bagram and just hours ago in the trauma bay, trembled only slightly as she loaded the last item into the box, the photograph of her and her team, 2014, before Sanjin Valley, before the medevac, before she'd carried specialist Marcus Webb 3 kilometers through enemy fire with rounds punching through the dust around them. The folded flag from his memorial service had lived in her locker ever since, pressed between her backup stethoscope and a spare pair of trauma shears, a weight she carried that no one could see. The suspension letter had come via email at 2:13 p.m. One sentence from hospital administration, pending investigation into scope of practice violations, effective immediately. No conversation. No meeting. Just termination clothed in temporary language. She'd read it once, committed it to memory like all classified briefings, then closed the laptop. The break room had emptied when she walked through to collect her things, the same colleagues who'd watched her work crisis after crisis now suddenly absorbed in their phones, their charts, the floor beneath their feet, anywhere but her eyes. The mug was cracked from a night shift for months ago when she'd set it down too hard after a 16-year-old came through the doors with a stab wound 2 millimeters from the subclavian artery. She'd saved him. No one thanked her for that. The succulent was dead because she'd forgotten to water it the same week Dr. Pierce had started his campaign, the week he began rewriting narratives about her in the spaces where silence could grow. Green to brown in 14 days. Metaphors existed for people like her, she thought, but she'd learned long ago that indulging in metaphors was a luxury for people who had time to feel sorry for themselves. The bus stop was 2 blocks from Seattle General. Rain hammered the pavement like applause for a performance no one had been watching. Laura stood under the shelter, the cardboard box held like a child, and waited. A woman beside her glanced over, registered something in Laura's face, some combination of stillness and readiness that made her look away quickly. Most people did. Most people sensed that Laura wasn't standing at a bus stop waiting for transportation, she was pausing, calculating, preparing for the next phase. The rain intensified. Still, she didn't move. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the knowledge that her intelligence operation, the real reason she'd been at Seattle General, the real reason she'd been watching a post-op cardiac patient with the intensity most nurses reserved for family members, had been blown open the moment she'd taken that scalpel from Pierce's shaking hand. She'd broken her own cover to save a life. That was the military code, yes. That was the reason she'd become a trauma nurse in the first place, the reason she'd kept the flag in her locker. But it also meant that somewhere, in some classified operations center, her handler was currently assessing the damage. Damage she'd caused by choosing to be human instead of invisible. The number 7 bus arrived at 3:14 p.m. She didn't board it. Instead, she turned back towards Seattle General, the cardboard box still tucked against her ribs. Rain soaked through her scrubs. She didn't feel it. Her phone had buzzed twice, encrypted messages, no caller ID, orders to stand down, to extract, to let the military handle the fallout. But there was one thing she had to do first. Room for 12 was on the 3rd floor. The nurse station didn't stop her because no one recognized her as someone who needed stopping anymore. She was already erased. She moved through the corridors with the fluid precision of someone who'd walked them 1,000 times, who knew exactly which tiles creaked, which corners had no surveillance cameras, which nurses looked up from their charts and which ones had learned not to see her at all. The veteran was awake. His name was Marcus Reeves, different Marcus than the one in the flag, but her mind always traveled that way, always looked for patterns, connections, the ways trauma echoed across years and identities. He'd been recovering well, the thoracotomy holding, the oxygen saturation stable, the infection markers dropping. A good outcome. One of the ones that felt like payment on a debt she'd never be able to fully repay. She didn't announce herself. She simply moved to his bedside and checked his bandages with the same clinical efficiency she'd shown for 3 years. Clean. Healing. The way surgical sites were supposed to look when someone had known exactly what they were doing. She was reaching for his chart when his hand moved. Not much, he was still weak, still tethered to monitors and fours, but his fingers found her wrist. His eyes, which had been dull with pain medication, suddenly sharpened with a clarity that made her stop breathing. "Viper," he whispered. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, steady and indifferent. Laura turned to face him fully. His eyes were green, the kind of green that came from somewhere in Appalachia, and they were locked on her face with the intensity of someone looking at a ghost made flesh. "Captain Lauren Bennett," he said, each word costing him effort. "3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. You carried me out of Sanjin." "You?" He stopped, breathing hard against the pain. "You came back." She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't do any of the things that civilians did when their covers were blown. She simply stood there, hand still on his wrist, and waited to see what came next. This was the moment. Not the suspension, not the humiliation, not the campaign Pierce had waged to erase her. This was the moment everything collapsed and rebuilt. The door opened. A man in dress blues, ribbon stacked precise as mosaic tiles across his chest, Colonel's insignia gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Marcus Reeves' brother. Laura had seen him in the waiting room 3 days ago, hadn't made the connection then because soldiers learned not to make connections, not to ask questions that might circle back. The Colonel looked at his brother, then at Laura with her hand still on the veteran's wrist, and something in his face shifted from casual hospital visitor to operational. "What did you just say?" the Colonel asked his brother. "She was my team leader. Bagram, 2014. She saved my life. Twice." Marcus Reeves' voice had strength now, the kind of strength that comes from relief, from finally being allowed to say something true. "That's Captain Bennett. Viper. She's standing right there." The Colonel reached for his phone. "Not to call security. To call someone else." Laura heard him say, "Sir, I need records pulled. Captain Lauren Bennett, service number Delta 77497 Bravo 1. Immediately." He listened to the response, nodded, and said, "Give me her Bagram citation." "Read it." His eyes never left Laura's face. "Military Police, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, March 2014, the voice on the phone said. Major combat operations. Captain Bennett led a 5-person team through enemy fire to extract wounded personnel. Single-handedly cleared 2 compounds, suppressed enemy positions from 60 meters, and transported 3 critical casualties 14 kilometers to forward operating base despite sustaining shrapnel wounds to her left arm and lower abdomen. Returned to the field the same day. Citation for Valor, Bronze Star with V device, and 2 Purple Hearts. The Colonel lowered the phone. Around them, the ICU had gone silent, not the silence of absence but the silence of presence, the kind of silence that happens when people suddenly understand they've been standing next to something they didn't recognize. The door burst open again. Dr. Pierce, his face already moving through shades of red, his mouth already forming words. "Security, get this woman off hospital property immediately. She has no authorization to." He stopped when he saw the Colonel's uniform, the phone in his hand, the way Laura stood with her shoulders squared. Behind Pierce, in the hallway, another figure emerged. Older, 2 stars on his shoulders, bearing the particular gravity of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives and saved them in equal measure. General Timothy Holloway, Deputy Director of Special Operations Command. Laura's handler, dressed in dress blues instead of the civilian cover he usually maintained, moving into the room like a man who'd just received orders and was executing them without modification. The general saluted Laura first, fist to chest, the military salute, proper and precise, before turning to Pierce with a calmness that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. "Dr. Pierce. Your hospital administration has been trying to reach you for the past 6 hours. You've triggered an automatic security review into all your communications, all your interactions with this patient, and all your contacts in the past 4 weeks." Pierce's face shifted from red to something closer to white. "I don't understand. I was conducting an internal investigation." The nurse overstepped her authority. "She performed unauthorized procedures. She is Captain Lauren Bennett," the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all power and no hurry. "She was embedded at Seattle General conducting classified military intelligence operations. Her nursing position was cover. When you initiated an investigation into her credentials, that triggered mandatory security review protocol. Every call you made, every file you accessed, every record you altered, it all got flagged automatically. The colonel pulled a folder from his uniform jacket. We've got 17 cases here. Post-operative patients. Complications documented in initial surgical notes, then removed from the medical record. All the deletions were made from your secure access. All the handwriting matches your formal write-up of Captain Bennett. Pierce looked at the folder like it was made of razor wire. Those were clerical corrections. Standard quality assurance. I don't know what you think. Anderson case, a voice said from the doorway. The nursing director, her hand shaking, but her voice steady in a way it hadn't been when Pierce had threatened her job. You told me to change the time of death. You said it would look better for the hospital. The medication interaction Captain Bennett tried to prevent, the one you said she was overstepping scope, that's the one that killed him. Another nurse stepped forward. Then another. The ones who'd abandoned their lunches when Laura walked into the break room suddenly found their courage. The intern who'd been reassigned to night shift spoke about falsified time of death reports. The charge nurse mentioned the Anderson case wasn't alone. There was a pattern. Years of pattern. 17 confirmed cases. 17 families who didn't know why their relatives had died. The general didn't raise his voice. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately pending criminal investigation for medical fraud, patient endangerment, and obstruction of justice. You'll be hearing from the state board, and you'll definitely be hearing from the FBI. 2 military police entered from the hallway. They didn't grab Pierce. They simply stood, professional and indifferent, waiting for him to move or resist or accept the inevitable. He removed his hospital badge with shaking fingers. The ID card that had granted him authority, that had given him the power to destroy people he felt threatened by, that had protected him for years, suddenly weighed nothing in his hand. Laura watched him escorted out without moving. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge the moment. She simply stood there in room for 12, her hand still on Marcus Reeves' wrist, as the veteran's eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from something like recognition, like witnessing truth finally enter a room where lies had been allowed to breathe for years. The general turned to her. Your cover's blown. Your operation's transitioning to new personnel. Command wants you back at Langley for debrief and reassignment briefing. He paused. Though I suspect you've got a few things to finish here first. 6 months later, Laura Bennett pushed a cart through Seattle General's trauma unit as head nurse, not investigator. The folded flag remained in her locker, but now it had company, a photograph of her and Marcus Reeves at a VA benefit, his tattooed arm around her shoulders, both of them finally smiling without the weight of secrets. He'd made a full recovery. He came back to volunteer weekly now, running peer counseling sessions for other veterans, other people trying to rebuild lives after trauma. The intelligence operation she'd been running completed successfully, its surveillance protocols restructured and reinforced, its goals achieved despite her cover being blown. Sometimes the best missions ended that way, quietly, with the asset intact and the operation's true purpose still classified. Dr. Pierce's license remained suspended indefinitely. The state medical board confirmed 14 cases of deliberate record alteration. 17 families received settlements. He taught CPR certification now at Raleigh Community College, demonstrating chest compressions on plastic mannequins to students who scrolled their phones and checked the clock, waiting for the $15 per hour course to end so they could leave. He wore street clothes instead of a white coat. He looked away quickly when Laura's car passed through the parking lot one afternoon. She simply nodded once, acknowledgement without triumph, without satisfaction, without anything except the understanding that some people had paid for their choices and were still paying. The break room at Seattle General filled when Laura entered now instead of emptying. Colleagues asked her opinion on complex cases. The new chief of surgery, a former Navy flight surgeon named Dr. Reeves, no relation, but the universe had its own sense of timing, personally recruited Laura to develop a civilian military medical exchange program, a way of bringing combat medical training into hospital trauma protocols, the kind of training that had kept 17 people alive during her time as Viper. A new nurse, hired just 3 weeks ago, asked Laura one morning how she stayed so calm under pressure. They were standing at the medication dispenser, prepping medications for morning rounds. Laura thought about Bagram, about Sanjan Valley, about the teammate whose flag she carried. She thought about Dr. Pierce and his campaign to erase her, about the moment she decided invisibility wasn't worth another person's life, about what it meant to be a warrior in a place where warfare looked like saving people from becoming statistics. "You remember what you're fighting for," Laura said quietly. "Everything else is just noise." The nurse nodded like that made sense, like that explained something fundamental about why some people moved through crisis like water, like ice, like certainty itself. She didn't ask what Laura was fighting for. She didn't need to. It was visible now, finally visible, in the way Laura's hands moved with absolute confidence, in the way she gave orders and people listened, in the way she'd saved a life when someone tried to make her invisible and then kept saving lives even after being told to stop. Laura walked through Seattle General's corridors during evening rounds, her stethoscope around her neck, her posture carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd operated at the highest levels of combat and now brought that precision to medicine. The same hallways where she'd worked 3 years in silence, where Dr. Pierce had built his campaign on the idea that a nurse was just a nurse, just someone following doctor's orders, just someone who could be erased without consequence. That wasn't her anymore. That had never been her, really. It was just what she'd been pretending to be. The closing line appeared in thought: sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story about hidden heroism and standing up to workplace retribution resonated with you, please subscribe for more stories about the warriors you don't expect. Hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to know their quiet strength matters, and drop a comment. Tell me about a time you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value. We're building a community that recognizes the truth: heroism isn't always visible, but it's always worth witnessing.